Hello, everyone. This is a quick review video about Chapter 9, An Introduction to Ecology. So what is ecology? It's the study of how organisms interact with each other and their environment. And this one's probably going to be quick because a lot of this stuff you might be familiar with already, but I'm also going to include this for a final exam review session later on if you need to brush up on these topics. We broke down the different ways that the environment can be studied, different kinds of ecology, and also different kinds of ecologists. Organismal ecology studies the morphological, physiological, and behavioral adaptations in an ecosystem. And remember, adaptations are heritable traits that increase fitness in an individual. Population ecology studies the number and distribution of individuals in a population. A population is the same species at the same area and the same time. And so population ecologists study how a species changes its numbers and changes its distribution. Community ecologists study all of the species in a certain area and how those species interact, their numbers, how they change, their distributions. Ecosystem ecology studies all of the organisms in a region and includes the abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are non-living factors, which we will discuss in a little bit. Global ecology studies the biosphere, which is the living sections of the entire Earth. So they study, global ecologists study the changes in the biosphere as well as the human impacts on the biosphere, which is increasingly important to look at. And conservation biology is an integrative subject. It seeks to study, preserve, and restore threatened areas, populations, and communities. So it ties in a lot of these. And you'll find that ecology is very interdisciplinary, both within biology and outside of biology. And for a certain issue that you're trying to solve, you might have several of these different forms of ecology that you use as a model to look at the problem and come up with some solutions. Abiotic and biotic factors are important to understand because they determine a species niche, which is the range of conditions a species can tolerate and the resources it can use. This is important because in an organism, they have fitness trade-offs, which limit environmental conditions where a species can live. So, for example, a tree might be well adapted throughout its evolutionary history to live in a jungle, but the fitness trade-offs limit its ability to go elsewhere. It wouldn't be able to thrive in a desert, for example. So it's important to consider all of the different factors in an environment and understand a species' adaptations to its environment. And we talked about that with evolution at the beginning of class. So go ahead and review that because that will also be critical for our final exam. So what are some abiotic and biotic factors? Well, abiotic factors are the non-living factors in an environment, such as the amount of sunlight, which is critical for plants, the temperature, the precipitation, the salinity of the water. There's a ton of other ones you could consider, like mineral content in the soil, things like that. Biotic factors include the kinds of pollinators present, the pests, the predators, the parasites, and the prey. Many P words, so maybe you can remember that. Then we talked about different key species that an ecologist might want to study, such as encroaching species and invasive species. Encroaching species are native to an area, but they're expanding the territory to where they could be a threat to other species and their distributions. An invasive species is not native to an area, but it's introduced somehow, and it begins to outcompete the native species. So these species are very critical for biologists and ecologists to look at, because they want, if they're conservation biologists, if you're concerned about conserving an area and its community and its species, you want to make sure that that you have a balance there, that there is no organism preventing a proper population size for the native species. And again, it's also important to consider the human impact of have we introduced some non-native exotic species into an area, and what are the impacts of that? And this happens for plants and animals, so it can be a big problem. We talked about biomes a lot. The first ones we talked about were terrestrial biomes. And terrestrial biome conditions are governed by its average annual temperature and precipitation, and the annual variation in the temperature and precipitation. Why is this important? Well, different biomes can have different net primary productivities, which is the total amount of biomass, aka the primary producers, generated by the carbon fixation minus the amount oxidized during cellular respiration. So what does this mumbo jumbo mean? Well, biologists want to know how much food is available for organisms in a location. So you can estimate the net primary productivity by measuring the above ground biomass. So essentially the plant life above the roots, to determine how much organic matter is available as food. Because if you keep the food chain in mind, the prey tends to eat the primary producers and predators eat the prey. And then of course we have scavengers and decomposers to help start the cycle over again and release some of the nutrients back into the soil to be used by the primary producers. So it's critical that we understand how these levels can change in different biomes. And we talked about a few specific biomes, such as first the Arctic tundra, which has a low productivity, low species diversity, low above ground biomass, low precipitation, and low temperature. Its ground is covered by low plants and lichens. These are the Arctic regions, but insect abundance can be high. Next, moving closer to the equator, you have the boreal forest or the taiga, which also has low productivity and species diversity and lower temps and precipitation levels, although they can be a bit higher than the tundra. And here conifers are abundant, and there can be a high above ground biomass, but still generally low species diversity. The temperate forest has moderate productivity and diversity, with a lot of deciduous trees and evergreens, and the productivity and the diversity is affected by the seasons. So we are increasing the productivity and diversity as we move through these biomes generally, but we still have the seasons that play a role in photosynthesis in plants and the trees, for example, which provide food to the other organisms present in that environment. Temperate grasslands are also known as prairies or steppes. They have lower productivity, but the soils can be fertile. Here, as you might expect by the name, grasses are dominant due to the dry conditions, and the plant life is dense on the ground. Deserts and dry shrublands can have extreme temperatures, being very hot during the day and very cold at night. Um, of course, they have low moisture generally and low productivity. Growth of plants is slow. You might have some cacti which have modifications to conserve water, since water is not abundant at all, very scarce. Lastly, tropical wet forests have high above ground biomass, high species diversity and high productivity, and there can be a wide array of habitats. So you can see a lot of these are almost polar opposites of each other, no pun intended. And you can see how the abiotic factors such as the temperature and precipitation levels can really determine what can live in that environment. And lastly, we talked about aquatic biomes. And the abiotic factors that determine the aquatic biomes are salinity, which is the salt content in the water, water depth, water flow, and nutrient availability. And we talked about 3 different ways that nutrients are made available in aquatic biomes. The first one is coastal runoff. So all rivers travel to the oceans, and when a river meets an ocean, you have an estuary, which is abundant in nutrients. Ocean upwellings happen at the edge of the ocean. All of the abundant nutrients from deep within the ocean can be cycled up more towards the shore. And then lake turnover is related to seasons, the circulation in the water of the hot and the cold water through periods of the lake being frozen in the winter, and then melting in the spring, being warm in the summer. So we talked about freshwater lakes and ponds, freshwater wetlands, streams, estuaries, and oceans. I encourage you to look at just some qualities of those. Those should be pretty clear. You're probably pretty familiar. You may not be familiar or else familiar with the zones. In the ocean, we have several zones that we can divide the ocean into. The intertidal zone is it's where the tides occur right at the edge. So it'll be submerged at high tide when the tide comes in, and it exposed at low tide. Going further into the ocean, you have the neritic zone, which is from the intertidal zone to around 200 meters. It's defined by the continental shelf, and here you can find coral reefs. The oceanic zone is the open ocean. The benthic zone is at the bottom of the ocean on the zones. Photic zones are sunlit regions. Remember that the amount of sunlight that can access oceans is changed because of water being present. So it's definitely more limited. And also consider that the presence of sunlight and oxygen played a key role in the evolutionary transition to land. And aphotic zones do not receive sunlight. Lake zones have the littoral zone, which is the shallow along the shore, where plants can grow. The limnetic zone is where water can really receive enough sunlight, but it's too deep for plants to take root. And it also has photic, aphotic, and benthic zones like the oceans. So that's it. Pretty short. So I'm going to be reviewing this again for the final exam review in a few weeks. So stay tuned for that.